Hello YouTube. In this video I'm going to outline Wittgenstein's private language argument from his book Philosophical Investigations. This is one of the most famous arguments in philosophy. It's also one of the most frustrating because there are many different interpretations of what Wittgenstein was up to here. There is dispute over how exactly the argument works. There is dispute over exactly which parts of the philosophical investigations are supposed to constitute the argument. Indeed, although this is called the private language argument, many philosophers deny that Wittgenstein was even attempting to give arguments, at least in the sense that philosophers often conceive of them. So, with that caveat in mind, we will turn to Wittgenstein. Now, one point that's crucial to keep in mind is that the private language argument is only one part of a much broader project. So it's worth saying something about the context in which this argument is given. Much of Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations is an extended attack on what's sometimes called the Augustinian picture of language. This is a view of language that, as Wittgenstein sees it, has led philosophers astray, that leads us to treat certain questions as intelligible and as open to investigation that are actually nonsensical. So Wittgenstein aims to displace this picture, and in doing so he hopes to show that many traditional philosophical problems are actually pseudo-problems. They're not really problems at all. They only seem to arise because we're in the grip of a mistaken picture of how language works. So his book begins with a quote from Augustine, which rather nicely expresses the Augustinian picture. So how is it that we learn to understand a language? Here's what Augustine says. When they, my elders, named some object and accordingly moved towards something, I saw this and I grasped that the thing was called by the sound they uttered when they meant to point it out. Their intention was shown by their bodily movements, as it were the natural language of all peoples, the expression of the face, the play of the body, and the tone of the voice which expresses our state of mind in seeking, having, rejecting, or avoiding something. Thus, as I heard the words repeatedly used in their proper places in various sentences, I gradually learned to understand what objects they signified, and after I had trained my mouth to form these signs, I used them to express my own desires. So this presents us with the following kind of picture. Every word in a language has a meaning. The meaning is a kind of mental state that's correlated with the word. And this meaning consists in the word picking out an object, or the meaning is what allows the word to pick out an object. So essentially, words in a language are names of objects, and then we form sentences by combining the names of objects in the right sort of way. So how does a child learn a language? Well, by observing the behavior of other people, the child comes to understand what object a given word, a given sound, stands for. And if she understands the word properly, she will have the same meaning in her mind that others do in theirs. She will associate the word with the right object, with the same object that other people do. And she can then use words to express her own thoughts and feelings. So the child has prior access to her feelings and to the objects in the environment. So she knows, for instance, that she is thirsty and she wants water. What she needs to learn is that the word water stands for water. And once she's learned this, then when she feels thirst and she wants water, she can say water, which will hopefully prompt others to give her water. So on this view, meanings are they're sort of mental states that are independent of language. Language is a tool to express these pre-existent meanings. So this is a picture of language. Now, associated with this picture of language is a particular picture of the mind. There is a distinction between mental concepts, such as pain, and behavioral concepts, such as crying. Crying is a way of expressing pain in one's behavior. Now, philosophers have often seen this as a distinction between inner private states and outer publicly observable states. So mental terms, such as pain, refer to these inner states. Behavioral terms refer to the observable states that may be caused by the inner states. So what it is to be in pain is for there to be something going on inside your mind. There's a special kind of entity or process that occurs within a inner private world. So essentially, one's mind is akin to one's own private room, and mental states are like objects in the room. And this is a room that, in principle, no other person can access. You can't break down the door and look into my mind as you can break down the door and look around my bedroom. My inner experiences are known to me, they're known to myself with certainty. While I can, I can doubt that the external world is as it appears, I can't doubt that the inner world is as it appears. Many philosophers have assumed that these inner experiences provide the foundation for the rest of our knowledge. The empiricists try to show that knowledge is derived from sense data, where sense data are, they're experiences, they are objects within this inner world. But my inner experiences are not directly known to others. Other people can only work out my inner mental states by making inferences from my outward behaviour. Now, if we combine this picture with the Augustinian picture of meaning, then we get the view that mental terms are meaningful in virtue of referring to inner subjective experiences that take place within one's private mental room. So the word pain, for instance, gets its meaning through its association with an object in the inner world. If I want to learn what pain is, I should introspect. I should turn my attention inwards and observe my own mind when I'm in a state of pain. And this will reveal what the word pain means. So, I have this prior grasp of my own ideas, my own mental states, plus various objects around me. And learning a public language is a matter of learning which sounds or, symbols are associated with which things. Now, the private language argument is one of the ways in which Wittgenstein tries to undermine this view of language and mind. So with that said, let's turn to the argument. Now, the conclusion of the argument is straightforward. The conclusion is there cannot be a private language. What exactly is a private language, though? Well, Wittgenstein defines it as follows. He says, the individual words of this language are to refer to what can only be known to the person speaking, to his immediate private sensations. So another person cannot understand the language. So a private language is not simply a language that you invent for yourself that you haven't taught anybody else, as when you might invent your own personal code. Clearly there's nothing wrong with doing that. There's plenty of people who have already done that. You can like create a secret code. Obviously, you can use terms with sort of, you can come up with your own meanings for terms. Yes, obviously you can do that. The thing is that if you have a secret code, well, a secret code could, in principle, be communicated to another person. Even if you have never, in fact, communicated it to another person, even if nobody ever learns how the secret code works, in principle, you could communicate it, right? When you take a piece of, English language and you translate it into a secret code, you could, in principle, tell somebody else how it has been translated, and you could teach them the code. So that's not a private language. Similarly, there is nothing problematic about having, your own thoughts, your own private thoughts. There's nothing problematic about inner speech, thoughts that you never express to anybody else. Nor is there anything problematic about writing a private diary that nobody else ever reads. Again, we do this all the time. So Wittgenstein is not targeting these sorts of things. And the reason is that all of these things could be translated into ordinary language, right? A private language is a language that, in principle, nobody else could understand. The terms of the language are defined by reference to a person's inner private experience, without reference to any public states of affairs, without reference to anything in ordinary language. So even if you were to observe the other person talking to themselves and you observed all of their behavior and the context of their speech, it would be impossible for you to translate their language because you wouldn't know what the words refer to. So to be clear, what we're imagining when we're imagining a private language, we're not imagining inventing new words that are, associated with words already in the language. So I might use a new word. I might use the word blip, and then I can use the word blip to refer to the sensation of happiness. I mean, again, that would be basically a personal code that is in principle translatable, because I could tell you, hey, the word blip means happiness. So we need to, as Wittgenstein says, suppose I didn't have any natural expression for the sensation, but only had the sensation. And now I simply associate names with sensations and use these names in descriptions. The question is, can we conceive of a language like this? Could there be a language like this? Wittgenstein says no. Now, I mean, at first sight, this might seem like a rather puzzling question, okay, because the idea of a private language in this sense is, it's rather arcane, right? Like, what the hell does it matter whether there could be a language like this? Well, the reason why it matters is because it seems that the possibility of a private language is a consequence of the Augustinian picture. Recall that on the Augustinian picture, words are meaningful in virtue of being associated with some mental entity. Words name objects, and they may name external objects or internal objects, internal sensations. So I may look into my own mind, I find a sensation where the features of that sensation are revealed only to me by introspection. Nobody else can access that sensation, and then I attach a word to the sensation. Wittgenstein asks us to imagine a scenario in which humans had no outward expressions of pain. So pain in this scenario becomes an entirely private sensation. It can't be exhibited in behavior in any way. There's no crying, there's no screaming, there's no nursing of wounds, right? There's no searching for for painkillers or anything like that. There's just the inner sensation. So in that case, we would obviously never develop a public language for pain. We wouldn't, come up with the word toothache, for instance. That would not be part of our public language. But on the Augustinian picture, it would be possible for a person to invent for themselves a name for the sensation, right? This person would be able to create a symbol that refers to some sensation within her own mind without any interaction with the broader community. So she could invent a name for toothache, even though no one has ever taught her the word toothache, even though the word toothache doesn't exist in the public language. All she has to do is introspect and observe her mental states, and then differentiate different types of mental state and associate a word with a particular type of mental state. And she can say, oh, that's toothache. Right? That would be a private language. And that's surely possible on the Augustinian picture. So by showing that there could not be a private language, we undermine the Augustinian picture. So this is very generally speaking, the general sort of structure of the argument here, right? If the Augustinian picture is true, then a private language is possible, or it's coherent, or it's conceivable, or something like that. But a private language is not possible, not coherent, not conceivable. So the Augustinian picture is not true. Now, again, bear in mind, Wittgenstein himself arguably didn't really give arguments. It's not clear that Wittgenstein would have approved of this way of putting the point, but I think it's helpful to sort of see what he's getting at here. Okay, that's the idea of a private language, and that's why a private language is relevant. But what's the problem? Like, why shouldn't there be? Why is a private language not possible? So let's start with a thought experiment. Imagine a person is literally locked inside a room, which nobody else ever enters. And the room contains different objects at different times. Perhaps, for instance, items of food appear in the room at lunchtime. Now, it seems that the person inside the room could make a record of when food appears, right? They might keep a diary in which they write the symbol F every time they see food. So they see food, they write the symbol F. That's surely comprehensible. And, to be clear, so far, Wittgenstein wouldn't have any problem with this. I don't think, at least not on the standard interpretations. There's probably no problem with this. But then, if this is okay, well, then it seems perfectly comprehensible that I could similarly invent a symbol for what's happening in my mental inner space, that I could similarly invent a symbol for the private sensations in my own mind, right? So words within a public language get their meaning through association with public objects. Words in a private language get their meaning through association with private objects. We can give a word meaning by associating it with something. So suppose I experience a sensation and then I associate the symbol S with that sensation. I might keep a diary in which I write S on every day in which I have the sensation. Now, first thing to keep in mind is I can't give a definition of S, in the sense that I can't explain what S means in terms of concepts familiar from any public language. I can't say, for instance, the sensation S is a sharp burning feeling in the left shoulder. Because if I say that, then S is translatable into English and it's not a private language anymore. So what we're supposing here is that I define S ostensively. I give it a meaning ostensively. I simply turn my attention to the sensation. I point to it within my mind and I say to myself, this sensation is called S. In this way, as Wittgenstein puts it, I impress upon myself the connection between the sign and the sensation. My act of inner pointing establishes a connection between the symbol and the sensation that is then named, so that future uses of the name refer to the same sensation. So note that, for the person locked inside a room, the symbols in their diary can be taught to others, at least in principle. Other people could in principle get inside the room and then the person could say, oh, look, this symbol, right, that's referring to that thing there. It's referring to the food. When I see the food, I write the symbol. But in the case of the mental term S, nobody else can get inside my mind, even in principle. Even in principle, nobody else can see what it is that I'm pointing to when I use that term, right? You can never see what the referent of S is. So this is necessarily private. Now, Wittgenstein objects as follows. He says, I speak or write the sign down, and at the same time I concentrate my attention on the sensation, and so, as it were, point to it inwardly. In this way, I impress upon myself the connection between the sign and the sensation. Now, here's the problem. But I impress it upon myself can only mean this process brings it about that I remember the connection right in the future. But in the present case, I have no criterion of correctness. One would like to say, whatever is going to seem right to me is right, and that only means that here we can't talk about right. Now that's a little bit obscure, but this is often taken to be the heart of the private language argument. So what exactly is he saying here? Well, I'm not going to tell you, at least not right now, because what I'm going to do right now is do a little advert. I have a Patreon, so if you would like to support my channel, you can sign up to the Patreon and give me cash, and you can access bonus videos. So that's nice. More content, more of me. If you just want to send me a one-off donation, you can do that on PayPal. I should also say that even if you can't give a financial contribution, you can, at the very least, give the video a like. Subscribe to the channel, leave a comment. Any kind of engagement helps the channel. It's all useful. So anything you can do to engage with the video, it really helps. This channel is still, the videos don't get a huge amount of views, so anything helps. I also offer private tutoring in philosophy. I have a degree, a master's and a PhD in philosophy, so I'm qualified. You can send me an email if you're interested in setting up something. And I have a Discord which you can join. The links to all of this will be in the description. And, look, as always, anything you can do to help out is really appreciated. It helps keep the channel running. So, and that's nice, isn't it? We all want that. But what we really want is to get back to Wittgenstein. So let's do that. So what I'm going to do here is look at two interpretations of the private language argument. So we'll start with one of the earliest interpretations of the argument, and on this interpretation, the sort of crux of the argument rests on a point about about memory, and in particular, there's no independent criteria other than memory for the use of the term. So here's the idea. On Monday, let's say, I experience a sensation and I name it S. Then later, on Thursday, say, I experience another sensation, which I remember is the same type of sensation as before, and so I label it S again. I say, oh yeah, that's another example of S. That's the same sensation. Now, the thought is, look, I use this term S correctly only when I have the same type of sensation that was originally labelled with that word. But the question is, whenever I experience a sensation, how can I tell that S, that this is another example of S, right? So I recall in the past having had that sensation, I recall labelling it S. Now I feel like I'm experiencing the same sensation again, but I have no way to check whether my memory is in fact accurate. There's no independent criteria I can use by which to check my memory. Like, my memory is all I've got. My feeling that, oh, this is the same sensation as last time, that's literally all I've got. So suppose that the sensation on Thursday is in fact different from the one that I had on Monday. Even so, I recall it being the same as the one on Monday. I feel like it's the same as the one on Monday. So the key thing to notice here is the facts about the sensation experienced on Monday can have no influence on my use of the term. They are actually irrelevant to my subsequent use of the term. What's guiding my use of the term is simply my feeling that I'm using it in the same way. It's just my feeling that, oh, this is the same sensation as before. So when I use S on Monday, S is supposed to pick out a sensation with such and such properties, right? It's supposed to be like connected to a sensation with properties A, B, and C. But the term can't actually function in this way because what guides my use of the term at later times is just a memory, a feeling that it's picking out the same properties. There is no other constraint. Hence, whatever seems right is right, as Wittgenstein puts it. And so yeah, on this interpretation, the crucial point is that since all I can rely on is my own memory of the use of the term S, there just is no criterion of correctness for the word. But the very notion of being, right or wrong, correct or incorrect, that presupposes a criterion of correctness. It requires some way in which, errors can be identified and then corrected. So, I mean, the general point is this. For the term S to be meaningful, there must be a rule for the use of S, so that S correctly applies to certain types of mental states and it does not apply to other types of mental states. There has to be some rule for how the term is to be used. But a person can be said to follow a rule only if there is an independent standard of successful performance, beyond, just feeling like one has successfully followed the rule. If there is no independent standard such that, it can be verified whether the rule is applied correctly, there is no genuine rule, and that's what's missing in a private language. So David Pears puts this as follows. Imagine, for example, trying to become a good marksman on a rifle range where you were the only person that ever saw your target, and even then you only ever glimpsed it down the sight of your rifle before you fired, and never again. In such circumstances, there would be no point in pulling the trigger. I mean, you can't learn how to follow a rule without a standard of success that can be applied to your attempts at following the rule, which can then be used to improve your performance. All that you have when you're on that rifle range is just the feeling that you might have been successful. Like, I have the feeling that I hit the target. That's it. Similarly with my use of the term S, all I have is, at a later time, I have another sensation. I have the feeling that this is the same sensation as before. That's it. So, I mean, we compare this then to the case of a public language. Now, of course, even with a public language, there is still a skeptical challenge about memory, because everybody's memory is fallible, so in principle, we might all forget what a word means. But the key point is that for a public language, there are means by which a given individual's use of a word can be corrected by others. So if S is the term of a public language, let's say I introduce S as the name of a colour, then other people can dispute my memory. Like, I see the colour on Monday, I call it S, then I see a colour on Thursday and I call it S. But other people might object at this point and say, no, you've remembered things incorrectly. So it won't be the case that whatever seems to me seems right is right. It might seem right to me that this is another case of S, but actually, no. Other people might come along and say, you're wrong, and my memory is. There's no reason to think that my memory is any better than all of theirs. So we have an independent check. It would be like checking the reports in one newspaper against the reports in various different newspapers. In a private language, by contrast, nobody else can see inside my mind, and nobody else can see what S is supposed to label. So they can have no say on how the term is applied. The only way to check the accuracy of my memory here would be, well, I mean, there is really no way. I mean, what do? Just consult my other memories? As Wittgenstein says, as if someone were to buy several copies of the morning paper to assure himself that what it said was true. So the most famous objection to the private language argument on this interpretation is the Robinson Crusoe problem. It seems conceivable that there could be a person who is born completely alone on an island who nevertheless survives into adulthood and who develops a language by themselves. They're never taught a language and they never interact with anybody else. I mean, maybe this isn't psychologically possible for human beings, but it seems conceptually possible. And the worry is that the private language argument just rules out this possibility. Some Wittgensteinians have embraced this consequence, although there is another response which would go as follows. So Crusoe, alone on his island, can still appeal to public objects to create independent checks on his use of terms. So let's say that S designates a type of object, say a particular type of rock. Well, Crusoe can take one of these rocks, he can etch the symbol S into it, and then retain this rock for future reference. Then when Crusoe comes across another rock that he feels is an instance of the S type, he can check that feeling against the sample rock. And now he has an independent test of his use of the term, not just his memory. It won't be the case that whatever seems right is right. Okay, let's turn to a somewhat different interpretation of the argument. I'm drawing here on Mary McGinn's work, and this is the stage setting interpretation. So the issue in the previous interpretation has to do with remembering one's use of the term over time. On the stage setting interpretation, the problem is not that there's no independent check on the meaning of S. The problem is that the sort of ostensive definition provided by inner pointing just can't establish any meaning in the first place. So S is supposed to be a symbol for a sensation. But the worry here is none of the usual procedures for naming things or for reporting sensations have taken place. So by comparison, consider a scenario where a part of my brain is electrically stimulated, and as a result, I make the noise zzz. Well, we can suppose that I make the noise every time my brain is stimulated in that way. So, I infallibly respond with zzz whenever there's that kind of brain stimulation. Is the noise zzz a word? Is it a name for a particular sensation? Well, surely not, right? I mean, yes, there's an event, right? There's something going on in my head and there's a noise associated with it, but that doesn't make it into a name, right? There's more that's required. Something more is required. I mean, what if I also had the intention to name something? I mean, maybe you could imagine that another part of my brain is electrically stimulated in such a way that I just form an intention to give something a name, right? Would that be enough to make zzz into a name? Well, again, it doesn't seem like it would be. There's a difference between, intending to do something and actually doing it. There's a difference between believing that you're doing something and actually doing it. So, the point of this example is just, clearly there are certain procedures, there are certain things that have to be in place in order for naming to occur. The question is, right, what is required in order for a word to become the name of a sensation? Wittgenstein states the issue here very clearly. He says, when one says he gave a name to his sensation, one forgets that a great deal of stage setting in the language is presupposed if the mere act of naming is to make sense. So let's say that I experience a pain. It's very tempting to think of it in this way. It's tempting to think, okay, I feel the pain directly, and then, you know, the nature of pain is just immediately apparent to me. Like I just know what pain feels like when I experience the pain. So I can then give a name to the sensation. Maybe I call it S, right? And the rules for the use of that name will then be given by the sensation itself. So basically, anything like that is a pain. So as Wittgenstein puts it, I simply associate names with sensations and use these names in descriptions. It seems, you might think, oh, that's all that's required for naming. And on the Augustinian picture, that is all that's required for naming. But Wittgenstein will object that this is too quick. And there's a few reasons for this. So the first problem here is that there are any number of ways that a word could be associated with an object. So let's say that I point to a glass and I say the word zoop. What does this mean? So I'm pointing at a glass and I'm saying the word zoop. Well, it could be the name of a natural kind, maybe glasses in general, so that, zoop just means glass. Or it could be the name of a particular type of glass, say pint glasses. So zoop would mean pint glasses. It could be the proper name of a particular object. So it could be that particular glass on my table. And then zoop would be analogous to the name Kane Baker. It could refer to the property of transparency. It could be an expression of surprise at the beauty of ordinary objects. Or it might not be related to the glass itself in any way. I mean, maybe I'm just using the glass to represent something else. So suppose I draw a map and I put the glass on the table and then I say, this glass represents a mountain. Well then, when I turn my attention to the glass and I point and I say zoop, maybe I'm saying something about a mountain. Maybe I'm naming mountains, right? So the kind of ostensive definition involved in pointing and saying the word zoop, like when I point and I say, this is a zoop, in order for that to count as, the name of pint glasses, say, there's a lot of context, a lot of stage setting which is required. It requires stage setting which, as Wittgenstein puts it, shows the post where the new word is stationed. In order for zoop to name pint glasses, I must intend to name a type of object, and then that requires that I'm already competent with the grammar of object vocabulary, and it requires some sort of context where the distinction between these types of glasses makes sense, and so on. One thing to notice here then is that even by saying that S names a sensation, we've actually already presupposed a public language. We've presupposed the grammar of naming and of sensation vocabulary, both of which are parts of public language. So as Wittgenstein says, sensation is a word of our common language, not of one intelligible to me alone. It looks like even in trying to imagine this scenario where we have a private language, we're already actually helping ourselves to the resources of a public language. Now, maybe the private linguist could tell herself that she's, doing something else, that S is some other sort of word. It's not the name for a sensation. But, even this is to presuppose a public language, right? The word something, say S names something. Well, naming and things are part of public language with public criteria of meaning. So, we already, we run into this problem. What we're missing when we even try to set up this thought experiment, where we have this experiment where, S is the name of a sensation. What we're missing is that we're presupposing a whole load of stage setting that has taken place within a public language. So a second issue here, to draw from a point made by PMS Hacker, is how exactly is private ostensive definition supposed to determine a rule for the use of a term? So presumably the idea is that when I turn my attention upon a sensation and I label it S, I create a mental sample of the sensation. And then in the future, when I experience new sensations, I can call up the mental sample, comparing the sample with the current sensations. This is analogous to how, if I want to know whether, this paint is International Klein blue, I can take a sample of International Klein blue, which, has been previously established, and then compare the new paint against the sample. The problem with this idea, in the case of a private language, is that in order to say that some memory is a correct sample of S, I must already have prior knowledge of how to apply the word S correctly. That is, in order to remember which sample is associated with S, I must already know what S means. So to quote Hacker, deliberately calling up the memory sample of S rather than some other sensation requires that one knows what S means. Yet calling up this sample was meant to be what knowing the meaning of S consists in, not to presuppose it. So note that the issue here is not memory skepticism. It's not that I might, maybe I've made a mental sample of S, but that I might not remember the sample again later. We can just stipulate a thought experiment in which I have perfect memory. The problem is that in calling up a memory sample of S, so in calling up a mental sample of S, calling up a mental sample of S from one's memories presupposes knowing the meaning of S, right? So in order to say, okay, this is a sample of S, I need to know what the meaning of S is. And so calling up the sample of S can't constitute the meaning of S, because having the sample of S presupposes the meaning of S. So, okay, what's the sort of point then? Well, ultimately, the conclusion is this, right? It's going to follow that a mere private ostensive definition, an inner pointing, cannot in itself determine any particular way of using a symbol. So I experience a sensation and I point at it and I say S. Later, I experience what I feel is the same sensation and I point at it and I say S again. But what is the meaning of the term S? I mean, if the meaning is just a matter of the sensation I'm now having, then of course, my use can't be correct or incorrect. I could point at anything and say, this is S. I've not set the stage there. It must be the case that the symbol S is used in the same way the second time that it was used in the first time. But what way was it used in the first time? The mere act of inner pointing cannot make it correct to use S in any particular way. So by performing the inner pointing and then writing the symbol S, absolutely nothing follows about how S should be used. So what we want to say is, it's correct to apply S to this sensation and incorrect to apply S in other circumstances. But the private language gives us no resources to make any sense of this, because S hasn't been used in any particular way in the first place. Attending to a sensation and saying, this is S, that tells me nothing about what S is or about how S is to be used. As Mary McGinn puts it, directing attention inwards and saying S is not a way of giving a definition. McGinn summarizes the key point of the argument as follows. First, the act of naming presupposes a grammar or a technique of employing a word within a language game. And second, the mere act of looking inwards does not supply this grammar or specify a technique of employment. So, private ostensive definition is not sufficient for meaning. So, it's maybe worth considering then, if this is right, what would be required to set the stage for naming? How would we do that? Well, we would need to give S a use in the language. And what would that look like? Well, Wittgenstein does give an example of this. So he suggests the following scenario. Suppose I were to discover that whenever I write the symbol S in my diary, a manometer shows that my blood pressure rises. Well, now I've got a very useful result. I have a way to detect rises in blood pressure without using any apparatus, right? I can just, whenever I get the feeling of writing S down in my diary, I can say, my blood pressure is rising. And so at this point, we could decide to take S as the name for a sensation, presumably the sensation of rising blood pressure. Now, of course, once the term has been correlated with a publicly observable phenomenon in this way, we're no longer in, this is no longer a private language, right? But the question here, the interesting question is, well, what is it that makes S the name of a sensation in this scenario? It is the distinctive grammar of the word. So, for instance, it would make no sense to say that other people can experience my S, that we can literally share exactly the same S, that like we have the same S object, as it were. In the same way, it makes no sense to say that other people can literally experience my pain. That like my pain is literally shared. Or it would be possible to pretend to be an S in the same way. It's possible to pretend to be in pain. Or it makes sense to ask how long S lasts for, just as we can ask how long a pain lasts for. The S state can play a special explanatory role. We might explain a person's behavior by citing that they are in S, just as we might explain their behavior by citing that they are in pain, and so on. So in this way, we see that S, in this scenario, has the same grammar as other sensation words. So plausibly, it names a sensation. But the crucial thing here is private ostensive definition, this inner pointing to a hidden mental state, that has no role whatsoever here. Even if those hidden mental states changed each time so that there was nothing in common in terms of inner experience from one S to the next, the correlation between my uses of S and rising blood pressure, well, that would still be useful, and we could still count S as the sensation of rising blood pressure, regardless of what's going on in some hidden inner space. So note then as well that this example shows that private ostensive definition is not necessary for meaning. So we've shown that it's not sufficient for meaning, now we show it's not necessary for meaning. So, okay, so to conclude then, we've seen two interpretations of the private language argument. The memory interpretation assumes that there is the successful naming of a sensation initially, and then it puts pressure on the idea that this meaning is that this meaning can be carried over time. Right? When I use the word S at a later time, it just makes no sense to say that I'm using it in the same way as I did at an earlier time. The stage setting interpretation locates the problem at an earlier point, right? There are just no grounds for thinking that there was any successful naming in the first place, because the way that a word is used cannot be determined by the sensation on which I concentrate when I utter a word. So, those were two interpretations of the private language argument. Now, that's certainly not all that can be said about this argument. There are other interpretations of it, but hopefully this has given you some idea of what Wittgenstein might have been up to. Now, before ending, it's worth turning back to our ordinary sensation language, because there's an important interpretive question about whether Wittgenstein is committed to behaviorism, to the view that the meaning of sensation words just reduces to behavior. So basically, according to behaviorists, propositions about mental states, such as John is in pain, are reducible to propositions about behaviors or dispositions to behave. What it is to be in pain is to exhibit or to be disposed to exhibit some set of behaviors, right? John is in pain means something like, John is crying, or John is nursing a wound, or John is seeking a painkiller, etc. So in that case, the meaning of the word pain is determined by observable behavior. What it is to be in pain is to have some set of behavioral dispositions. Now, this is how Wittgenstein has sometimes been interpreted. Certainly, there were many behaviorists who have been inspired by Wittgenstein's arguments, or at least they've been inspired by their interpretations of Wittgenstein's arguments. So Wittgenstein himself actually explicitly denies behaviorism, at least in this sense. So it's worth saying a little bit about why this is. Like, what is he actually up to if he's not a behaviorist? So the Augustinian picture, the thought is that by attending to my pain, by attending to this inner object, I learn the meaning of the word pain. I thereby learn how the word pain is to be used. For Wittgenstein, this is backwards. First, I learn the grammar of the word pain. That is, I learn how to use the word pain. I learn its use in the language. That tells me its meaning. And then it's because I know how to use the word that I then know what to attend to when I'm asked to attend to a pain. So pain does indeed refer to, what we can sensibly call a private sensation. you know, it in the sense that like nobody else literally feels my pain, nor is my pain just a matter of mere behavior. And, you know, it's actually perfectly reasonable to, you know, explain people's behavior by citing these inner sensations, right? Like I can say the reason why John is crying is because John is in pain. That's, you know, a perfectly fine thing to say. But the question is, what's important, like the important question for Wittgenstein is, how does this reference to a sensation take place, right? So again, sensation is different from behavior, and sure, we can, if we want, say that the term pain refers to a sensation, but how does this take place? It's due to the distinctive grammar of the word in public language. So as Wittgenstein sees it, there is a significant difference between mental concepts and behavioral concepts. But this has to be understood as a difference in the grammar of the concepts. It's not ultimately a difference in, you know, the location of entities which those concepts pick out, as if psychological concepts pick out entities within an inner space and behavioral concepts pick out entities within an external space, right? No, the distinction here is a distinction about it's a matter of the grammar of the concepts. So consider, you know, the use of the term pain, right? Like when we, again, you know, we can say that like pain is private, and that's a reasonable thing to say. But like what is that? What does that consist in? Well, it consists in the fact that, for instance, it makes sense to say, or rather, it makes no sense to say that I know that I am in pain, right? That statement, the statement "I know that I'm in pain," is rather odd. I have pain, I experience pain. My own pain is not an object of my knowledge, right? But it is sensible to say that another person might know that I'm in pain. For the same reason, I can't doubt whether or not I'm in pain, right? At least, you know, not severe pain. Like if I have an excruciating toothache, it wouldn't really make sense for me to, like, you know, oh, okay, I wonder whether I'm really having this toothache or if I'm just pretending. Like, no, I have the toothache. Like, that's it. But it is sensible to wonder whether another person is really experiencing the pain that they appear to be exhibiting. Or consider that, like, phrases such as "I'm in pain" or "my head hurts," these are expressions of pain, whereas phrases such as "Frank is in pain" or "Frank's head hurts," these are descriptions. I'm not, you know, when I say Frank is in pain, I'm not expressing Frank's pain. So the thought is that once we understand the grammar of the concept of pain and how it's related to other concepts such as knowledge and doubt, we see the sense in which pain is private. The privacy of pain is a feature of the grammar of psychological concepts. Thus, Wittgenstein says, the proposition "sensations are private" is comparable to "one plays patience by oneself." You know, these propositions tell us something about how the concepts are used. So there is a significant difference between pain and pain behavior. It's a distinction in the grammar of concepts, not in the location of entities. How do we learn what pain is? Well, not through introspecting objects in an inner space, but through investigating how the term pain is used. And when we investigate that, we will find that behaviorism, in the sense that I outlined it earlier, is pretty damn implausible. Mental concepts are very different from behavioral ones. But that is all I have to say for now. That's Wittgenstein's private language argument, or at least that's a couple of ways of looking at the argument. I hope that was helpful, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye, everybody.